Hello gamers and welcome back. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshak if you want to call me by my in-game name, and Happy New Year to everyone watching. Of course, with our most popular decks video, or the monthly meta, we posted at the beginning of every month, so hopefully everybody had a great new year, or has a great new year, and I'm excited to be bringing you a lot of the new decks that have sprung up from the mean streets of Gadgetsons. Of course, when we posted this a week or two after the release of the set, we couldn't get a full, picture of what was going on with the meta because it was still very fresh, but now a month after the set has been released, a lot of the most popular and strong decks that are out there have been solidified. The deck list more solid than ever, and I think we have a much better grasp in this one than we did the one we did 2 or 3 weeks ago on what's going on in the meta. Keep in mind, guys, that this video again goes over the most popular decks in Hearthstone, and it doesn't go over every deck. There's no way I can tell you every single deck that there's going to be out there, but this video is going to be going over the top 90 to 95% of the decks that you're going to see when you queue and you play ranked mode. So with that said, we're going to head into our first class we're going to be talking about, and that's going to be Priest, but more specifically the Reno Priest. There's a couple classes that stand out a little bit more than most. Priest is one of them, especially Dragon and Reno. We're looking at Reno right now. It runs very, very similar to any other Reno deck that you're going to play and come across. There's a one of in all of those decks, so you can expect once they use a Dragonfire potion, they're no longer going to have another one in the deck. And kind of the deck, it's interesting because this deck, along with the other Renos, is very much control, and it doesn't necessarily burst you down with any particular combo, unlike Reno Warlock does. This is more of a, I don't want to say fatigue, because most of the time you can just basically run your opponent out of steam is the best way I want to put it. Most of the time you're going to be able to pick up value trades, use cards like Brandon to Kazakis, which is now like a crazy card that was released with the mean streets, and now that everybody's been able to kind of tinker with them a little bit, realizing that Brandon Kazakis is almost an auto win versus any mid-range deck feels really, really nice. On top of that, you've got basically the Dragon package inside of a Reno package, inside of the Priest control package, so you get a lot of packages with this deck, and there's a lot of good, but there's also the weakness of it, of course, losing to very aggressive base decks like the Aggro Shaman, because unfortunately if you don't draw a Reno or some of your early game cards to be able to withstand the assault of an aggressive base deck, this deck will fall. So as good as this deck is versus some mid-range decks and control decks, it does fall if it does not draw correctly versus some of the more aggressive base decks. The next one we're going to be looking at, sorry the deck list is so big here, but when there's not as many cards in the deck, it kind of, expands in size. But this will be your Dragon Priest. So instead of running, the Reno package, this is going to be the Dragon package. And it uses a combination of early game dragons, strong mid-range dragons, single target removal to be able to basically out-tempo and get rid of anything your opponent plays that you really don't like. In my opinion, I would have to say this deck is a little bit more consistent than the Reno one, just because it's a little bit more easily pilotable, if that makes sense. You can make less mistakes with this particular deck than you can Reno. I'd have to say if you're better with the Reno decks, there's more choices, which means if there's more choices, there's more rooms to make mistakes. More rooms to make mistakes, the greater chance that if you're not the best player, you're going to make a mistake somewhere in there that could really cost you. But decks that have more limited amount of choices allows you to, a lesser chance to pick the wrong one, which then will hopefully get you the win that you need because you're not making a whole bunch of difficult choices, each having their own pros and cons. So this deck for the newer player, the more intermediate player, is a much better pick in my opinion, but just less rewarding. A better player would maybe play the Reno, this being the more average to intermediate player. But like I said, very curve driven, getting your Twilight Whelp on 1, your Historian on 2, your Talon Priest on 3, into the Twilight Guardian, Corruptor, Operative, and then from there, if it reaches late game, you have 2 huge Dragonfire potion clears, along with the Double Entomb to kind of take whatever you need. The reason there's only 1 Ysera in the deck and not more big dragons is just having 1 big dragon is, I think, okay, because the Netherspite Historian, along with the Dragon Operative, allows you to kind kind of pull cards from either your opponent's deck or a discover pool that you may not had the option to pick from, and then based on the situation that you find yourself in, you can actually pick whether you want to go for the late game or you need more early game things, or maybe a field clear, whatever you get from the operative. But this deck is very powerful and very strong in my opinion right now. A lot of people kind of overlook Priest as being a really good fast ladder deck, but surprisingly Dragon Priest can close out a lot of games really quickly due to the fact that they can just rush the board with a bunch of basically Hearthstone. The next one we're going to go over is going to be Rogue. There's not a lot of Rogue decks floating around, but one that has always been, this deck has been around for a long time now. It's the Miracle Rogue, but now it has the Pirate package inside of it. So the problem with original Miracle Rogue was it was very kind of, I don't want to say slow at the start because they could have an explosive start, but most of the time it lacked a good turn 1, 2, and 3 play. And then once it kind of, well, good turn 3 play would be SI, but besides SI, you know, they would basically, the turn 4 was their Tomb Pillager, turn 5 Azure Drake, from there to turn 6 is Auctioneer, right? Like they had once mid game hit, they had stuff to play, but the early game was severely lacking. But now with cards like Patches and the Small Time Buccaneer, it allows Rogue to kind of have this decent early game, and if not dealt with quickly, you're able to kind of burst your opponent down, whether through double Cold Blood Leroy, or the Pirate package just gets your opponent low enough in towards the mid game that you're just able to easily kill them with Tomb Pillagers, SIs, and Evises. It all depends on the current situation, but this deck, again, really hasn't changed a lot. It just now has the Pirate package, so it's basically the same Miracle Rogue every month I've talked about, but just has Pirate package. Counterfeit Coin is also a new inclusion with the -1 preparation. Keep in mind, guys, that these deck lists are my deck lists. This is my build of how I build Miracle Rogue. Don't copy this card for card. Kind of build it as you see fit. If you don't agree with something and you're like, oh, why do you have this in your deck instead of that? Just change it yourself. Don't ask me why I built the deck the way I built it. Build the deck how you would like to build it, right? I built my decks because that's how I feel like I need to build them, and that's my play style. You can do what you want. I hear a lot of those questions of why isn't this, why isn't that? It's like I built this for specific reasons, and if you don't like it, you can change it. But this is basically just your standard Miracle Rogue with, again, Pirate package. There's a kind of, I don't even want to say there is, because like the Jade Golem Rogue is a deck I've been pushing right now for a very long time. I made a deck guide on it. We did a ton of deck testings. Unfortunately, the deck is, first of all, not a very popular deck. I've yet to see a single Jade Golem Rogue I've gone against in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games I played this season. Along with that, when I played Jade Golem Rogue, it wasn't the greatest of decks. It was really fun. Don't get me wrong, it's one of my favorite decks to play, but it's just not very good. And remember, this is the most popular decks each month, not whatever your favorite is or whatever you like the most. This is the most popular, so I'm going over those. So moving on to the Druid here, this is going to be the Avianna Coon combo Cthulhu Druid. Keep in mind that there's another one just like this that has Malagos and Auctioneers, and with Moonfires and all that good stuff. I know that one's too, but I figured if you can just show one, you're basically getting the same thing, because Avianna, I should say, not Anivia, into the Forgotten King, into the large amount of creatures for the one turn kill, whether you're Moonfiring, Living Roots, and swiping, or you're playing Cthulhu with a bunch of buffers, playing the Panda, return him back to his hand, and then playing him again. So the basis of this deck is to basically ramp with cards like Wild Growth, Nourish, Mire Keeper, sustain yourself with cards like Feral Rage, Wrath, and Swipe, Raven Idol either into more card draws or ramp. You have your mid game, which is Azure Drake for continuous draw, Nourish if you need to draw, or for mana. Normally the first one is draw, or if you have two of them in your hand, then you can go for the mana and then draw. But normally Nourish is draw. The Dark Arakoa is to buff your Cthulhu and kind of put taunts out there because of the aggressive base deck. And then we jump into the combo, and a lot of you are looking at this version and say, why don't you just run the Malagos and the Auctioneers and all that good stuff? You can do that version. This is just, I think the Cthulhu version's a little bit cooler, which is why I'm showing this one, and it's a little bit more off the curve, but it's either version of the deck is what I'm pointing out to be the most popular. I don't find, again, the reason to post two of them, because it'd be like the same deck list with 2 cards or 3 cards different. So the win condition is this one is you play the Avianna, which makes all of your creatures cost 1. You play Kun the Forgotten King, which can have the option of either giving you 10 armor or refresh all of your mana crystals. So you choose the one that refreshes all of your mana crystals. So you now have a 5/5 that brings all your creatures cost 1. You've got Kun the Forgotten King, which is just refreshed all of your mana crystals, and he's a 7/7. From there, you're going to play Bran. You're going to play any Cthulhu buffers you have, which will buff it twice because of the battle cry, and then you're going to play Cthulhu, which with Bran out is going to trigger him twice. So let's say your Cthulhu's a 15/15, it's going to deal 15 damage, then it's going to do 15 damage again, then you're going to use your Youthful Brewmaster, return Cthulhu to your hand, and then you're going to play Cthulhu again, dealing an additional 30 damage because Bran's battle cry makes the 15 trigger twice. So you can do 60 damage burst with this combo. The other one runs the Malagos and Auctioneer, so you basically do the same thing, but instead of Cthulhu you play Moonfires, and the Auctioneer allows you to continuously draw, and you have 10 mana and creatures only cost 1, so most of the time you're basically able to draw the remainder of your deck, play whatever creatures you like, and deal large quantities of damage to your opponent's face. Both decks basically a 1-turn or 2-turn kill setup, and give yourself a very sizable board. Again, I know there's 2 versions. I'm only posting 1. The next version is going to be the Jade Golem Druid, which is I would have to say more popular than the Kun combo. The Kun combo is it's Jade Golem, but I didn't want to leave the combo out because if you saw that and you get owned by it, I don't want you getting mad at me, be like, why didn't you tell me about the combo? So I'm just warning you, there is the combo out there, but more than likely it's going to be this Jade Golem Druid, which is a very slow, grindy, if you leave this deck alive past turn, I want to say 10, it's going to outvalue you. It's going to outvalue you with, yeah, I'm said that right. Outvalue you with creatures that are huge, because it has the ability to play Jade Idol into the Auctioneer, which allows the deck to just keep drawing and summoning Jade Golems. So eventually there's going to be a time in this game where the Druid pumps out like a 10-10, an 11-11, a 12-12, and a 13-13 Jade Golem all in one turn while still having more Jade Idols and still drawing in their deck. It's insane. So this deck, as it beats Control Warrior, it's going to beat, Control Priest. It's going to beat any basically other control deck that doesn't have some sort of burst. Like, let's say, for example, this deck, even though a Reno deck like Renolock has Reno, it also has the Faceless Manipulator Leroy combo, and Druid is weak to burst because you can just kill them all in one turn before they can kind of react to that. Unlike Priest, which Priest has no burst, so this Druid deck will most likely be able to outvalue any kind of Mage or Priest deck because there's not a whole lot of burst in there. And by burst, when I talk about Mage, is the Reno Mage, which is, again, a deck we haven't gotten to, but just throwing it out there for example. So as good as this is versus other control decks, it does have a weakness, and that's to combo decks or more aggressive base decks that can rush this down prior to it just summoning a large scale army of Jade Golems and just smashing your face in. The next class is going to be Warrior. This is going to be where the most decks thrive right now. Keep in mind, most popular deck guides, I get comments every month of why did you leave this deck out? It's because I've played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games this month, and these are the top ones by far. This is 90 to 95% of the decks that I'm seeing being played, minus the combo decks, which either or, it's still popular, I guess you could say. So this one's going to be the Control Warrior, made mostly popular by VLPS. The list is very similar. I've made some minor changes, but overall it has the body of what VLPS has been playing. If you go against any aggressive to mid-range deck, this deck holds up very, very well. It's got Revenge, it's got the Winax, it's got Dirty Rat, it's got Taskmaster, Shield Blocks, Justicar, Ally Armor Smith. It has everything it needs to beat any mid to early game deck that's looking to rush it down. For the late game package against more of control-based decks, we've got, of course, the Justicar, the Gorehowl, the Ysera, and the Elise Starseeker, which are very important in the control matchups. Unfortunately, though, looking back on, let's say this deck goes against Jade Golem Druid, it's going to most likely lose unless you could get a good burst turn with Hellscream in with like double Taskmaster and you happen to get them around 15 health. But most of the time this deck does lose in the very, very late games to other Jade Golem's deck because you run out of resources to kill giant creatures if they play right. If they decide to go in with a crazy turn, you could just brawl it out. They have no cards in their hand and then you can win from there. But most of the time this deck does fall prey to other control decks, but this deck performs very well against the, again, like I said, the aggro to mid-range decks. Keep in mind that against like Control Priest or like Reno Mage, you can pull off the Elise, and that could be a really good win condition later on. That's not what I'm saying by control decks. I'm talking about those control Jade Golem decks, not just normal control decks, which this deck does put up a good fight against as well. So moving into the Pirate Warrior, keep in mind there's two versions of Pirate Warrior right now. There's one that's a more minion heavy, and then there's one that is more spell burst heavy. The difference is that this one is going to be the minion heavy run. It doesn't run Mortal Strike, and it doesn't run the Heroic Strike. And the reason being is it relies on its creatures, such as the Naga Corsair and South Sea Captain to buff its creatures. So instead of dealing 8 additional damage with like Mortal Strike, Heroic Strike, it'll deal the 8 additional damage by having 2 more creatures on the board or buffing the current creatures you do have on the board. So it's kind of 2 takes at the deck. The minion heavy, some of you are asking, okay, so what would be the pros and cons of running the minion heavy versus the burst one? The minion heavy one is better against, first of all, in my opinion, the mirror and other mid-range decks, because the problem with the burst one is that if you play against a mid-range decks, you basically have the same start, and then your late game, you're wanting to burst out your opponent if you get them low enough, while the mid-range is just going to outvalue you because their early game never made it to their face because their early game was exactly the same. So early games, they nullify each other. No damage is basically done to either side. And then you're left with a bunch of face damage through spells. And this other one still has creatures in it that can go face every turn. So the mid-range is normally going to beat the aggro when they have relatively decent starting hands on both sides. Let's say you just, the spell heavy one gets a crazy hand, the other guy gets a garbage hand. Of course, at that point in time, the other one has a huge advantage because he drew bad. But assuming that both players draw decent, the more aggressive base one will lose. And that's where this minion heavy deck comes from. The second version, which would be, I guess we can head into it right here. We'll go back in a second. This one has the advantage over when you're playing against Reno decks, because normally if you're playing against any sort of Reno deck or control deck, you're going to want to beat them prior to turn 6, 7. That's normally when the game starts turning around in their favor. They can play large scale AoE and still heal themselves or play taunts or whatever they happen to have. So this bursty one with Immortal Strikes and Heroic Strikes, you're able to kind of kill your opponent before they can play Reno, which the minion one still can do. It just has a much harder time because they don't have cheap spells to just double Heroic Strike for 4 mana, deal 8 damage. So that's kind of the pros and cons of the minion heavy one versus the kind of spell heavy one. So heading back to the deck that we skipped, this would be the Dragon Pirate Tempo Warrior, which basically has the pirate package with the small time buccaneer and the patches, along with the dragon patches, or the dragon package, which would be the Alexstrasza's champion and the curator, the Draconoid crusher. So basically this is the at one time, for those of you who did play back then, and I wouldn't say back then like it was that long ago, Tempo Dragon Warrior ruled the meta. It was like the top deck along with mid-range Shaman, right? And then it kind of faded out, and now it's being brought back in because of the ability to have, you know, the small time buccaneer. The packet, first of all, the curve of this deck is just insane, but on top of now having the pirates, because the pirates benefit from you having weapons like the small time buccaneer, is just more insane because you have N'Zoth's First Mate, you have the War Axe, you have the Arcanite Reaper, and in the pirates, of course, you have the upgrade and you have another Arcanite Reaper. So there's a lot of pros to the Dragon Pirate Warrior now because of Small Time Buccaneer and all the weapons in the deck. I would have to say it plays very similar to the Dragon Priest, where you're just playing basically, like, let's say turn 4 happens and a Twilight Guardian's in your hand. There's probably not a whole lot of thought there. It's not you're not doing there was a good expression, you're not doing what is it, like jumping jack, like intellectual jumping jacks in your head playing this deck. You're just kind of going on curve and making maybe max 2 decisions, 3 decisions a turn. So that deck we already reviewed, and now we're going to be heading into Shaman. So at one time, mid-range Shaman was the the supreme leader of decks. Now it is no longer the mid-range Shaman, but more of the aggressive base Shaman that is now kind of pushed past the mid-range and is what most players are playing when we're performing in the top legend ranks, along with wanting to grind extremely quickly on ladder. So as we can see here, it of course includes the pirate package with the small time buccaneer and the patches. It also has cards like lightning bolt and bloodlust to be able to burst your opponent down. In my particular deck list, I don't like lava burst because the card doesn't help me versus the mirror matchup, which if this is going to be a really popular deck, a lot of people are going to be playing it, which means I don't want lava burst. I'd rather have cards like Aya Blackpaw, the lightning storms, the maelstrom portals, the 2 feral spirits and whatnot. But this deck again curves out very well. You start yourself with the small time buccaneer. It has spirit claws and the jade claws to be able to buff your buccaneer the early game. It still has the totem golem package as well with basically jade lightning is my lava burst in this particular deck. And then the bloodlust is interesting, right? So you could choose to run the lava burst instead of the bloodlust, but I found that the bloodlust is a little bit better win condition versus those Reno decks. And it's always a card that you'll find that, let's say you totem, you have like 3 or 4 totems on the board and you're just like, man, I wish I had a bloodlust to be able to push like 12 damage out of nowhere. And if you have any creatures and if they have any attacks or you have any spells in hand, it's just an astronomical amount of damage you can do in one turn if you can just bloodlust it out. Granted, bloodlust is a pretty bad card to have in your hand versus the other aggressive matchup. That's why we only run one of it, and hopefully you just mulliganing away and you really don't see it versus the other shaman. So again, my choice of building the aggro shaman, you can change it as you see fit, but the deck kind of speaks for itself there. I'm not normally I would post the mid-range here, but the mid-range is very, very close to how you would build this. I think there's about a 4 or 5 card difference. There's not a whole lot. You basically take out the early game, the early game in the burst. So you take out the bloodlust, you take out the small time buccaneer and the patches, and you'd include basically another lightning storm and a rag and some hexes. That's the difference between mid-range and aggro. There's not a whole lot there, so I figured there was both mid-range and aggro play the Faceless, the Azure Drake, the Jade Lightnings. Everything is basically the same besides the Hexes, the double lightning storm, and maybe a rag or like an Alakir the Windlord. So I figured that was kind of silly to post 2 deck lists that were very similar. The next one is going to be the Jade Golem Shaman. I would have to say 90% of the time or 95% of the time it's going to be the more aggressive base shaman or the mid-range, but once in a while you'll play against some person playing Jade Golem, and I just want you guys to see the deck list so you can keep in mind what to expect. They don't win their game necessarily through huge amounts of burst in one turn, nor do they win their game through, being able to steamroll you with a 4-drop 7/7. This deck is going to be able to beat you by basically making even trades and then being able to outvalue you late game with cards like Thing from Below, Blackpaw, and Chieftain. When they start pumping out 5/5 and 6/6 totem Jade Golems, it's really hard to outvalue that because they're paying, basically for a 4 mana card that's already a 2/3 and then summoning a 6/6 or a 7/7, and then all of a sudden you don't have enough removal to take care of the creatures, and you've been trading all game trying to keep up with them. So very powerful kind of mid-range deck. I wouldn't really call this a control deck because the biggest card in it is the Chieftain, and it doesn't really do well in fatigue, but it does do well in the mid-range, and it does do well later on the game, but I wouldn't really necessarily call it I wouldn't compare this to Control Warrior, which is why I wouldn't really want to call it a control deck. The next one's going to be Warlock. I know you guys have seen a lot of this deck, and it is praised as one of the best, if not the best deck, just like the Aggro Shaman is on ladder right now, and that's going to be the Reno Warlock. It has all of the cards in it to perform very well. It's got combo. It has a combo that does 20 damage in one turn, which is pretty hard for most players to play around because 20 damage is a lot. All you have to do is 10, and that's not 20 damage is hard to play around. On top of that, it has a heal automatically back to 30. It has the ability to look for cards with tapping. It has large amounts of AoE, such as the Abyssal Enforcer, Shadow Flame, Hellfire, Demon Wrath. It's got a good amount of heal. It has taunts. It has weapon removal. It has great minions such as Sylvanas and Draxus and Mountain Giant and Twilight Drake. So this deck just has kind of everything you need to succeed in it, right? Like, if you don't draw this part of the deck, you have a strong this part of the deck. If you don't draw that, you have this. So there's a lot of options and a lot of leeway with this deck. The problem, however, comes with the play style of the deck, which is very It's slower. You're not, again, the burst is quick with the Leroy Jenkins Power Overwhelming Faceless Manipulator. That happens quick. But leading up to that point is very slow. You have to think about it a lot. Each turn, like I said, has a lot of decisions in it, and it's a pretty difficult deck to play. So if you're newer to this game and you're not really good at setting up like the next couple turns for yourself, I don't recommend playing this deck because it'll hurt you more than help you. Most of the Reno decks are very hard to play, and there's a lot of decisions to make each turn. Unlike like Dragon Priest, which you have, you know, maybe 2. This deck, each turn you might have closer to 5 or 6, you know, 2 or 3 decisions being really good, and then the rest of them being subpar but still somehow look good, and then you might go with the subpar play. But either way, very powerful deck, and you'll see a lot of it if you haven't already on ladder. The next class is going to be, and the reason I only went over here, we'll go back to Warlock. So the reason I'm only going over this deck, some of you may be asking, where's Zoo? Where's the aggro Warlock, which is called Zoo? In the hundreds of games I played, again, I've gone against 0 Zoo. Not a single person has played Zoo against me. Some of you may say, you know, you're rank 15, you've gone against 3 Zoos in a row. That's out of the ordinary, right? Like I've played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and not a single one. If there was some sprinkled in there, I would include it, but I don't even want to steer you guys in the wrong direction. 95% of the time it's going to be a Reno Warlock, or it could be a Handlock, which I haven't included in here because Handlock isn't popular yet, but it could be, which would be the 5%, which makes it not the most popular decks. Again, guys, remember, most popular decks here. Can't go over every deck or I'll be talking here every day. This video is already long enough. Okay. So the next one's going to be Mage, and it's going to be the Reno Mage. In my opinion, if you're going to run a Reno deck and you have the choice between any of the Reno decks, whether it's Priest, Warlock, or Mage, I would pick a Warlock because it's the best one. It has Burst, it's got Survivability, it's got late game, it has perfect curve. It's a super strong deck. Not to say that Reno Mage or Reno Priest is bad, but they're definitely, in my opinion, not as good as the Warlock. So looking at this deck, what is really good in it? Of course, the Reno package with the Kazakis is always nice, but what kind of sticks out to me the most is the Discover and the kind of the randomness, right? So we have Babbling Book, we have Bran, so you can Bran into Cabal Courier, Kazakis, which then you can use your Soulcaster to put 2 more Kazakises back in your deck to get 4 potions in total. On top of that, you have Archmage to generate fireballs, which is another win condition. You also have Alexstrasza, and the reason Alexstrasza's in here is because, let's say your opponent is again another Reno player, which is again a lot of Reno on ladder. I want to say like 30 or 40% of the decks right now are playing Reno in them, or if not close to that. And you know, they get down to about 15, 12 HP, they Reno back up, you Alexstrasza them down, their Reno is nullified. So that's why I'm playing Alexstrasza. The reason that there's Archmage instead of Medivh, because I know a lot of you questions are going to be like, why aren't you playing Medivh? It's the best card ever. You're playing Reno Mage and you're not playing Medivh. Oh my god, you suck. The reason is everybody's playing Acidic Swamp Ooze and everybody and their moms playing Reno Mage is playing Medivh. The problem with everybody doing the same thing is the fact that you know what they're doing. So when I play against another Reno Mage, I'm like, oh, they're probably playing Medivh. I hold Acidic Swamp Ooze in my hand, and then they play Medivh, I Acidic Swamp Ooze, and they concede because that's their win condition. And a lot of mages, I will see them hold their Acidic Swamp Ooze against me for the entire game because they think I have Medivh, and then when I drop Archmage and Alexstrasza, they're like, oh shit, I've been holding on to this Ooze, which has stopped me from doing a lot of things because I thought they had Medivh, but they don't. Oh my god, this guy's next level. So just keep in mind, just because everybody else is doing something doesn't mean you have to. Also, putting cards back in your deck is very important. So you've got Roaring Torch and like I mentioned, the Soulcaster. So unlike the Warlock class, you can't put cards back into your deck to make you last longer during fatigue. So if you and a Warlock are fatiguing, you can, brand Soulcaster 2 cards back. But just keep in mind, if you put 2 cards back, you can't play Reno until you draw at least one of them. I've seen that mistake happen before as well. So you just have to watch out for that. And with that being said, this deck, just like any other Reno deck, you have 1-ofs, you have to be careful of what you play with, and the win condition again is making your opponent basically run out of steam. And I don't want to say curving out well, because this deck doesn't need to curve out well. You just need to draw into your Reno, Kazakis, and basically single target or large scale removal sometime during the game before you die. But most of the time, if you draw Reno against any aggro or mid-range deck prior to 6, or even a little bit after 6, if you can survive, is just fine. So good deck overall. Very hard to play in my opinion. And yeah, so with that said, this basically ends our most popular decks for this month. All the decks it goes from aggressive all the way to super heavy control, so I like the variation there that this meta has brought. Unfortunately, a lot of it is Reno, so if you don't like Reno, it's kind of not your meta, but you know, at least it makes the control decks a little bit better now that mid-range Shaman doesn't rule the world. Also, Tempo Mage isn't in here because there's no reason to run Tempo Mage when there's Reno Mage, which is, I wouldn't say a better version, but if, like, let's say you put Reno Mage versus Tempo Mage, Reno Mage is going to win most of the time due to the fact that, of course, Ice Block and Reno, and then the Tempo Mage will run out of steam while this Reno Mage just wouldn't. So it's just like, why wouldn't you play the better version of Mage? Like I said, not every time, but most of the time. So that finalizes our most popular decks. If there's something I missed, let me know in the comment section below, or if you'd like to add on to any of these decks and help someone further looking for help, or maybe more of a description on a deck, feel free to leave that in the comment section below, because of course I can't talk about every individual thing of the deck. That's what my deck guides are for. So if I do happen to have any deck guides on any of these decks that we've gone over, I'll include those in the annotation to the left there, that way. And yeah, so I'll see you guys in the next episode, of course. Thanks for stopping by. I'm Warshak, and happy whatever the hell day it is.